Sex and drugs and rock and roll. Those are the top 3 reasons to get into the music business. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a world where there are no rules? But this, of course, often ends badly. What do you expect when you give some extremely talented yet emotionally immature or fragile people loads of money and then leave them to their own devices? There's often no one to tell these young people no. In fact, any bad behavior is often ignored or even encouraged. As long as the artist produces, the powers that be tend to turn a blind eye, even as the artist finds themselves in more and more stressful situations. Without any adults in the room, tolerances are built up, boundaries are tested, boredom calls for more extreme measures, substance abuse ticks up, and ever-increasing bad behavior becomes the norm. Things can get very, very weird very, very quickly, especially when it's time to party and let loose. Sometimes the rock and roll party goes too far, and, well, you'll see. I'm Alan Cross, and this is episode 59 of Uncharted, Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And here are 10 examples of when those parties went way too far. The life of a rock star has long been one of excess, rebellion, and breaking rules. There are countless stories of musicians doing very bad and very stupid things, which of course is something this program tries to cover. Frankly, it used to be a whole lot worse than it is today. Dumb, illegal, and criminal things still occur, but they happen a lot less than they used to. One wrong move captured on a cell phone and then spread through social media, and you could be effectively canceled within a week. But in the olden days, what happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. And what happened on the road, well, we won't speak of it. At least most of the time. But eventually, stories of these excessively bad incidents leak out, and some become part of rock and roll legend. Others have us think, if that happened today, wow. None of the bad behavior you're about to hear is excusable. Some will say, oh, it was a different time. And yes, it was. And in some cases, we do have to be careful about viewing something that happened 50 years ago through the lens of today. Things change, we evolve. But then some situations were and remain unambiguously wrong. And here are 10 situations where things went way too far on some level. We're going to start with an airplane. In the early to mid-70s, Led Zeppelin lived the life of rock and roll gods. There was booze, there was drugs, there were groupies, and there was loads and loads and loads of money. In 1973 and 1975, Zepp toured North America. Tour buses? Fly commercial? Please. They had the Starship, a Boeing 720 jet that used to be in passenger service for United Airlines. This was the replacement for a small private jet that didn't do well in turbulence. After a show in San Francisco in 1973, manager Peter Grant had enough of being bounced around in the cabin, so he leased a jet from a company called Contemporary Entertainment. This was a flying palace, an entire commercial airliner for one band and their entourage. There was room for 40 people. There was an extremely well-stocked bar, plenty of seats, plenty of tables, a bunch of revolving armchairs, and a 30-foot couch. There was also a stereo and an electric organ. There was also a TV with a video playback unit. No one had one of those things in 1973 and 1975. This was before Sony released the first VCR, so this was industrial-grade stuff. Primitive by today's standards, but back then, it was amazing. And if you went to the very back, there were 2 private rooms. One had a long, low couch and was covered in pillows, and the other was a bedroom with a shower room and a big white fur bedspread. The plane also got a special Led Zeppelin livery on the fuselage. The Starship was used to move the band, crew, groupies, special guests, and trusted music writers from gig to gig without the hassle of going through the public spaces of airports. Led Zeppelin's habit was to play a show, leave the venue quickly, and then head back to the Starship where the after party would begin. Actually, the party never really stopped. When they had the plane, things went 24/7. Richard Cole, the band's tour manager, says that things were often out of control, even at 35,000 feet. It was smoky, loud, and utterly chaotic. Drinking, drug use, naked people doing naked things. The starship saw it all. Pilots were known to complain about all the noise and smoke and banging and moving about in the cabin as they were trying to get the band and their entourage safely to the next destination. Some refused the flight assignment. Occasionally, drummer John Bonham would join the pilots in the cockpit, and that couldn't have been safe. Some stories leaked out, but because this was the era before social media and a time when trusted journalists were trusted to keep their mouths shut, the stories remained buried until the truth was blurred or forgotten. There was no need to do any sort of damage control. Zeppelin just stayed silent about their excess and let fans' imaginations do the rest. The plane itself took a lot of hits. There was plenty of damage to the customized interior. Crew members were often pranked or hazed. Alcohol and drugs were spilled everywhere. Pot and hash smoke got caught in the fabric. Cocaine was everywhere, the carpets, the couch, the chairs, the bedspread, and don't even ask what you'd see if you shone a black light on any of these surfaces. Yes, the Starship made touring easier. It allowed the band to party nonstop, and it disconnected them from reality. But because of that, it also allowed things to get out of control. When Zeppelin was on tour this way, they were completely cut off from the outside world. Plane, hotel, stage, plane, repeat. No interactions with fans. No sense of where they were at any given time. Days and nights and weeks blurred into one. They were isolated from reality in their own sealed ecosystem. What was the result? Well, massive dependency on drugs. Jimmy Page became a heroin junkie. He got dangerously thin, junkie-like, and he looked sickly and weak. He became unreliable, isolated, and this caused tensions within the band. Jimmy was often with Lori Maddox. She was a former child model who started hanging out on the Sunset Strip in 1972. She was 13. That summer, she met Jimmy Page for the first time, and that night she claimed she lost her virginity to Page. Again, she was 13. This was the start of a relationship which would last for 2 years. Yes, this was statutory rape, but everyone went to great lengths to hide the fact that Page and Lori were a romantic and sexual couple. Manager Peter Grant often locked her in a hotel room with a security guard at the door with orders to wait until Page returned from the concert. And she wasn't the only underage groupie Led Zeppelin ran with in those days. If you look at the band's 1975 album, Physical Graffiti, you'll find these words in a Robert Plant lyric in the song Sick Again. One day you're gonna reach 16, painted lady in the city of lies. John Bonham, a crazy guy even when he didn't have his own jet, became a raging alcoholic. He was said to be very sweet when sober, but as soon as he started drinking, he'd go crazy. In order to drink more, he'd snort coke so he could keep the party going. Heroin also crept into the mix too. This would later lead to a prescription drug problem when he was given a mix of antidepressants and antipsychotics. Nothing helped. The day before he died, on September 25, 1980, he banged back 40 shots of vodka over 12 hours. He passed out, was put to bed, but then vomited in his sleep and choked to death. Robert Plant drank, used coke, and took Quaaludes when he needed to come down and sleep. There's no evidence that he got into heroin. He quit drugs completely in 1977 and stopped smoking in 1980. Bonham's death affected him greatly. It was not only a wake-up call, but he counseled fellow rockers to just say no. It's rumored that he carries 3 Quaaludes in a bottle as a reminder of the kind of poison he used to take. John Paul Jones? Well, he stayed mostly above the fray. He'd have a drink or a joint, but he was a moderate, sedate person. He wasn't clean, that didn't happen until 1983, but he was relatively clean compared to the other 3 guys. The last time Led Zeppelin chartered the Starship was in 1975. It was used by Deep Purple, the Rolling Stones, Elton John, and Alice Cooper. When the Allman Brothers chartered the plane, they were delighted to find Welcome Allman Brothers laid out in lines of cocaine on the bar. The last person to charter the Starship was Peter Frampton in 1976. After that, the plane's age and abuse started showing. It was permanently grounded in 1977, sold several times, but never flew paying clients again. It eventually found its way to Luton Airport north of London, where it was scrapped for parts in 1982. But the Starship's job was done. It added to the myth of Led Zeppelin and in many ways set the standard for airborne rock and roll debauchery, a distinction that's yet to be eclipsed. Our second story involves a particular hotel on the Sunset Strip. In 1963, it opened at 8401 Sunset Boulevard, first as Gene Autry's Hotel Continental and then renamed the Continental Hyatt House in 1966. Jim Morrison, Frank Zappa, Pink Floyd, Deep Purple, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and many others stayed at the Riot House between 1968 and 1976. It was at a great location, right on the Strip, within walking distance of the famous Whiskey A Go-Go and the Rainbow. It became the place for bands to stay while in Los Angeles, and British bands in particular loved the place. The hotel was fairly permissive when it came to tolerating the antics of their high-paying guests. The hotel, like I said, was renamed the Riot House. Keith Moon of The Who was a bad guest. He'd often go on destructive rampages. He once set off some explosives in a toilet which completely destroyed the bathroom. The Who were banned several times. We're going to come back to them later. The Rolling Stones used the Riot House for their U.S. tours. Fans knew this and often gathered outside on the street, and things would get unruly. A constant police presence was required. Alice Cooper was a regular guest, although he'd often wake up in his room with no idea of how he got there. On the 1973 Led Zeppelin tour of America, the Riot House was the site of John Bonham's 25th birthday. His bandmates gave him a brand new Harley Davidson. John loved motorcycles, and the bigger and louder, the better. Oh, sure, he could have gone for a nice ride on the streets of California, maybe down to Malibu or something like that, but instead, he spent much of the next couple of days riding his new Harley up and down the halls of the Riot House, frightening guests and staff. There were stories of him riding it through the lobby, into elevators, everywhere. The noise and exhaust fumes were something else. Management finally shut it down. Bonham was banned, but only from riding motorcycles indoors. He paid for all the damage, and then he gifted the Harley to the hotel. The incident contributed to a complete ban of major rock bands by 1976. There was just too much damage going on. Too many things were being thrown out of windows onto the street, which was concerning from a death, injury, and insurance point of view. The Hyatt began some extensive renovations in 1976. No more open balconies from which TVs could be tossed. More security to prevent people from riding motorcycles in the hallways. And the hotel did whatever they could to kill the non-stop party atmosphere. It was renamed the Hyatt on Sunset in 1976 to help distance itself from its rock and roll excesses. The building is still there, and it's called the Andaz West Hollywood. It's a much, much quieter and safer place than it was in the days when rock stars were bigger than movie stars and could do anything they wanted. In a moment, we'll get back to Keith Moon and The Who. His craziness and partying not only got him banned from the Riot House, but from every single Holiday Inn in the world, or so it's said. There have been many crazy people in rock history, but there are two at the very top. There's Ozzy Osbourne, I covered his antics on episode 46, and Keith Moon, the absolutely insane drummer for The Who. He will get his own show in the future, but for now, I want to focus on his particular problem with Holiday Inn hotels. Actually, it's the problem Holiday Inn had with him, we think. On August 23rd, 1967, Keith turned 21. What actually happened that day is unclear because it's been merged with myth and legend and other stories about Keith. But if we peel everything back, we can determine the following. The Who was on their first ever U.S. tour, opening for Herman's Hermits, along with a New York group called the Blues Magoos. Things were pretty chaotic from the start, with Keith pulling a lot of pranks on his bandmates and the other groups. One night, a member of one of the other bands found a spider in his bed. On another, Herman's Hermits drummer pulled back the covers and found a barbecued head of a suckling pig in his bed. In Vancouver, Keith bought himself a pet piranha, which he kept in bathtubs, often tickling its nose in hopes it would try to bite him. That lasted until the night the water got so cold that the fish died. He left it behind on the toilet seat, wrapped in tissue, with a note to the maid. Keith bought a movie camera, a pretty expensive toy for 1967, and began filming things, often while completely naked. Hallways got flooded when fire hoses were turned on and then put back in their cabinets. Vending machines were ripped apart. In Montgomery, Alabama, Keith was delighted to learn of a powerful firework called a cherry bomb. He bought several, and when the tour rolled into Birmingham, he wanted to test their power. First, he put some cherry bombs in a suitcase and set it on a chair in his hotel room. The explosion blew through the suitcase and the chair. And to punish the hotel for bad room service, Keith and John Entwistle, the bass player, decided that they'd flush one down the toilet to, mess up the plumbing. But after he lit it, the toilet didn't flush properly, leaving the bomb in the bowl. Keith and John ran out of the room and slammed the door. The resulting explosion destroyed the toilet and created a hole in the floor. Then there's the apocryphal story from August 12th in Ashbury Park, New Jersey. For reasons known only to himself, he later claimed he was running from a couple of mob guys who were upset that he defiled the floor of the venue they just played. Keith escaped by running off a pier into the heavy surf of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the truth seems to be that Keith was on downers and a roadie had to jump in and fish him out of the water. Now, back to Keith's 21st birthday. The band, or at least Keith and bass player John Entwistle, checked into the Holiday Inn in Flint, Michigan after flying in from Winnipeg. The band did some rounds of the local radio stations. The Who's publicist arranged for Keith to drop off some birthday cakes shaped like drums. Like I said, Keith turned 21 that day. Back at the hotel, the front desk made sure the marquee out front read, "Happy Birthday, Keith." Nice touch from the Holiday Inn. He was chuffed and posed for pictures under the sign. And then after that, it was off to a gig at a local high school football stadium. It didn't go very well. Keith was so drunk, it was amazing that he could stay upright. After the show, Keith's birthday party really got underway. A ballroom on the main floor had been reserved for about 40 people. Members of the tour entourage, radio people, promoters, a few fans, and contest winners. A couple of cops were standing by, just in case. At the front of the room on a table was another drum-shaped birthday cake, this one much bigger than the others, and Keith used it to start a food fight. Okay, big deal. Then, various members of all three bands on the tour decided it would be a good time to tear off Keith's pants. So they did. And they found that Keith wasn't wearing any underwear. Not that that bothered Keith. He ran around the room, tripped, and managed to break one of his front teeth in half. This necessitated an emergency trip to the dentist, and because he was so drunk, he wasn't given anesthetic as the dentist drilled out what was left of his tooth. Meanwhile, the hotel manager had heard of the nudity and ordered the party shut down. The banquet room was evacuated and closed. But that just allowed everyone who was left to run riot drunkenly through the hallways. Someone grabbed some fire extinguishers and discharged them all over the place. A piano was smashed. Guests were thrown into the swimming pool. It got so chaotic that the supervising cops had to draw their guns in order to get everyone to leave. The Who's publicist, who was working frantically to settle the situation, realized that damages were getting out of control. $24,000, which is about $230,000 today. The band was eventually sent a bill. What's missing from this story? The truth. The tale of Keith driving a Lincoln Continental into the swimming pool. And this is because it never happened. The car story only exists because Keith came up with it. He invented the whole thing as cover for falling down, breaking his tooth, and ending up at the dentist. The riot at the hotel didn't even make the local papers. No one was arrested, and no one spent a night in jail. Nor were the Who banned from all Holiday Inns in perpetuity. In fact, the group continued to stay at Holiday Inns on this tour and a few others in the future. These stories were all made up. But because they made for such good stories, they were accepted as gospel. And given the things Keith was known to do, you could actually believe that all this stuff happened. The same thing may be true for an incident that allegedly happened in a hotel room in 1968. Or maybe it was 1969, we're not sure. Again, things are cloudy. Keith got it in his mind that the hotel room next door featured a fully stocked minibar, and he wanted it. Keith found a fire axe or some other sort of appliance, and then smashed a hole through the drywall. There was no minibar, and the room was occupied by a sweet old couple. Did this happen? He definitely went through a wall at a hotel at least once, and there was a party, but everything else appears to have been embellished by Keith and repeated over and over again as fact. Keith Moon never did change his ways. His drinking and drugging continued for years, even after several hospitalizations. When he finally tried to stop drinking, a doctor prescribed him a drug called clomethazole that was supposed to help with his alcohol cravings and withdrawal symptoms. But then, on September 7, 1978, he overdosed on the drug that was supposed to save him and died. Speaking of parties, one thing we didn't see in the movie Bohemian Rhapsody was an epic party thrown for the band at the Fairmont Hotel on October 31, 1978. The band was on an American tour, and Queen's seventh album, Jazz, was set for release 10 days later. What better place to celebrate a record called Jazz than in the city where jazz was invented, and a city where almost anything goes? The party was planned by record company people in LA. No one wanted to hear the word budget. The only requirement is that this event be epic. 2 or 3 scouting trips were made to New Orleans, and the Imperial Ballroom at the Fairmont was deemed as the only suitable venue. This party, which ended up costing $200,000, which is just under $1 million in today's money, was open to a selection of about 80 journalists flown in from around the world, another 50 or so record company executives — attendance for them was declared mandatory by upper management — and various freaky New Orleans characters. Total attendance was somewhere north of 300 people. Everyone arrived at the Imperial Ballroom at the Fairmont around midnight after Queen played the New Orleans Civic Auditorium. What followed was one of the most legendary rock and roll parties of all time. This being Halloween, the party had a witch theme, and excess doesn't begin to describe it. The ballroom was decorated with 50 spooky dead trees sitting in pools of dry ice smoke. The party featured a Dixieland band, snake charmers, hookers, jugglers, street entertainers, strippers, cross-dressers, 300-pound people wearing nothing but thongs, and a woman who could smoke a cigarette down there. All of these people had to audition for the gig, a process that took 4 days. Freddie Mercury was kept apprised of things and apparently loved the attention to detail when it came to sexual deviancy and perversion. So many people were hired that several bars in the French Quarter had to close that night because all their entertainers had been hired away. The only person who didn't get the call was a guy who specialized in biting the heads off live chickens. Guests were offered plumed and sequin eye masks, right out of Eyes Wide Shut. They arrived to find tables piled with food: lobster, shrimp, roast beef, and so on. There was a projection of a bunch of nude women riding bicycles tied to the new single, Fat Bottom Girls. And if all that wasn't enough, there are the stories about dwarfs. A number of little people were also hired as part of the catering. One hid under a pile of meat on the buffet table. Imagine the reaction of people peeling away the roast beef and then have this little person burst up through the table. And this happened over and over again throughout the night. But the most durable story is that an undisclosed number of dwarfs walked through the party with trays on their heads, and all these trays were piled high with cocaine. That's the story, but some of the people who were at the party say that this wasn't true. Either that, or the guests hoovered up all the available coke very, very quickly. Meanwhile, Freddie was walking around signing autographs on women's bottoms, and yet he was reported to be disappointed. "This is pretend," he said. No one was really sure what he wanted. Still, after the party wrapped up, he seemed to have enjoyed himself. The Jazz Halloween party was deliberately designed to be excessive, and like all excesses, things became exaggerated over the years. How much? Well, from those who remembered what happened, not that much. Finally, 2 stories about Guns N' Roses, one of the hardest partying bands that ever lived. So much alcohol, so many drugs, so many bad decisions. It's amazing that no one is dead, although a couple of them did come close. Let's start with Slash. He once got into a drinking contest with Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue. That turned into a fight, and Slash ended up having 4 vertebrae in his neck dislocated. On another occasion, Slash was speedballing coke and heroin at a resort in Arizona and decided to take a shower to freshen up. But that's when he started seeing shadow monsters, his description. He punched one of them and broke a glass door and then ran naked and bleeding through the resort. Then there was the time in San Francisco when Slash died for 8 minutes. In 1992, the Gunners were on tour with Metallica, and the partying was hard. After a show on September 24th, Slash indulged in a lot of alcohol and coke, and God knows what else. When he tried to stagger back to his hotel room at around 5 a.m, he collapsed. Fortunately, he was quickly found by a member of the housekeeping staff who called for help. Paramedics arrived to find Slash on the verge of cardiac arrest, and then his heart stopped. He was shocked back to life using defibrillators, but his heart did not beat on its own for 8 solid minutes, so he was technically dead. When his heart was finally restarted, Slash recalls a huge shock of energy and lights. But did that stop him? Nope. After a brief break, he continued with the partying until 2001, when he was diagnosed with cardiomyopathy, a result of years of substance abuse. Doctors gave him between 6 days and 6 weeks to live. The only thing that saved him was physical therapy and the installation of a pacemaker. And even then, he didn't get completely sober until after another trip to rehab in 2007. Meanwhile, bandmate Duff McKagan was little better off. At the same time Slash was dying in hotel hallways, Duff was drinking 2 to 3 bottles of vodka a day. He had built up a tolerance. He started drinking when he was in 5th grade. As soon as his eyes opened in the morning, he was drinking. There was always a bottle by the bed. What started with partying ended up becoming a survival mechanism. His body came to depend on alcohol just to function. When he lost his taste for vodka, he moved on to wine, up to 10 bottles a day. Any attempts to quit drinking failed because there was always another Guns N' Roses party to go to. This couldn't continue, of course. There were blackouts, long stretches of vomiting, and terrible stomach pain. His stomach grew swollen and rock hard. And then came May 10th, 1994. This was just a few months after his 30th birthday. He just couldn't stand it anymore. The pain was intense. He was alone at his house in Seattle and couldn't even reach the phone. Fortunately, a friend dropped in and was able to get him to Northwest Medical Center in Seattle. One of the first things Duff did was beg the doctor to kill him. The pain was that severe. An ultrasound was ordered, and the diagnosis was acute pancreatitis. His pancreas was barely functioning, and the size of a football. This also caused his spleen to swell to several times its normal size. While the pancreas had already blown open, the spleen was also in danger of rupturing, and if it did, his body would be flooded with corrosive enzymes and plenty of blood. It was a toss-up which would kill him first: internal bleeding or internal burns. He was days, maybe hours away from dying. Several liters of fluid were drained from his abdomen, and then he had to go into surgery, where doctors removed the part of his pancreas that had ruptured. When they sliced open his abdomen, smoke rose from his body. Those were the corrosive enzymes. They were literally eating him from the inside. Duff was in hospital for 6 weeks. The whole experience set him straight. It also helped the doctors told him that if he took another sip of another drink ever, he would die. He got into mountain biking and martial arts. He also became a serious student of investing and turned himself into a financial expert. And he's been sober ever since. There are hundreds of stories when the rock and roll party went too far. We haven't touched on Keith Richards. We haven't touched on Aerosmith, Dave Navarro, Billy Idol, and Rod Stewart. Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue and Dave Gahan are 2 more people who technically died for a few minutes. And this is a topic that we'll come back to at least several more times. Meanwhile, please, let's be careful out there. You can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. They're all free for the taking. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, email me at alan@alancross.ca. We can also meet up on all the social media sites, along with my website, ajournalofmusicalthings.com, which is updated with music news and recommendations every day. And it comes with a free daily newsletter filled with music news, opinion, and music recommendations. And there's my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music and alternative music through the decades. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy all for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.